The real hard part is the business model. And so for us, what we've done is we've said, how do you make a modular execution of a building not tied to your physical fixed expenses in a factory? And that's where we honed in on this idea of distributed manufacturing. Our partners that make kitchen pods, bathroom pods, structures, walls, floors, ceilings, do the manufacturing. We just do assembly. And so that means that our factory looks much more like a warehouse because we don't have to have a huge amount of fixed expense to actually get that running.
The factory is the product.
Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
And a passion for invention.
We want supply chain resiliency.
Make the United States into a manufacturing powerhouse.
What's very dangerous is to not evolve.
Andrew, thank you for coming on to Industrialized. Really excited to chat with you today and learn more about you and assembly.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I love talking about what we're building and I want to get into it.
So you graduated school, went straight into real estate development, and you have this super cool background of being able to blend software technology with real estate. How did this journey even get started for you?
So we can go all the way back. Maybe my parents are both engineers. My mom and dad worked sort of in the Bell Labs world. And I knew I loved engineering, but knew I didn't want to be that type of engineer. And went to school, studied real estate and finance and computer science. So when you think about those two worlds, they often are like oil and water, repel each other. And I was sort of hooked at this idea that technology could really change an industry like real estate and construction. And the first project that I ever worked on in the world of real estate was the tallest modular tower in North America. And so you can imagine like some 20-something-year-old running around being like, oh my God, I'm working for a company that's about to change the world. And everyone should Google that project, 461 Dean Street. Let's just say it was a learning experience in a political sense. And it did not go perfectly. And I think for me, that was both it's really good that it happened as the first project in my career because it was like, okay, I have a whole career to figure this out and figure out how to actually change construction. And so I spent a while at that company called Forest City, moved over to the arena team and finished out the end of the Barclays Center and the Nassau Coliseum. So a lot of these projects working for that company were these big public-private, hairy, gnarly projects that people said like could not get built. And they got built. And so that was just sort of like brewing in the back of my mind, like, okay, like doing the impossible in real estate is possible. Then I went to Google Sidewalk Labs, where that was probably like the second attempt at trying to combine technology and real estate. And we had such a broad mandate there to use technology to solve urban problems. And you can think about like how every person can have a different interpretation of what that means. But I worked primarily between New York and Toronto on this project that we were doing up there on really thinking about how you would build a city in today's world. So with the internet, with all the technology we have in place, starting from that point and then moving forward. And I did that for a few years and then came back to New York to work with a company called L&L, where my former boss and mentor was partnering with them, Marianne Gale Martin. And she brought me over and I stayed with that company for a few years and led a project called the Terminal Warehouse Project. So that was a 1.2 million square foot office building that we were converting from an 1890s warehouse into a Class A office building. And let's just say that was like a crazy time because we started that project pre-COVID and then built it throughout COVID. So the whole office market transformed as we were doing that. And during that project, I was really thinking about what's next, what is my career, and the partners at Shop Architects and some of the people I had worked with at Forest City had kept working on this idea of modular construction. And I got a call saying, hey, remember us? We were working on this a decade ago. Do you want to help us take this company to the next level? And that's how I partnered up with Shop and sort of spun a team out of Shop into what is now Assembly.
Wow. So then you walk into Assembly on day one, you're pretty much building, you've built a modular factory. So how do you start to implement your vision day one?
So I think this is like a very interesting sort of like founding story as well as like business model specific to our business. So modular construction is something that has been around for decades and has had many fits and starts and a graveyard of people that have come before us. And so from a business model perspective, we were not starting from scratch. Like this was not a eureka idea of, okay, we're going to do this for the first time. Really, Assembly's approach is all about a deep understanding of the evolution of the modular business model, as well as a deep understanding of some of these other adjacent markets like aerospace and automotive that have pushed the boundaries on manufacturing. And so from day one, when I started about 3 years ago with the partners at Shop, they had a team working on this. And my role coming in as CEO was to take this and actually start building. And I think that was one of the big, like, first few months of question and deep thought we had was, we have this technology that can go after large urban buildings and markets like New York, but how do you actually go about commercializing it, right? You don't just immediately build a 30-story tower, but at the same time, if you're not proving the right things, you're going to fail. And so we had to spend some time figuring that out. And the first project that we honed in on was the project I'm sitting in right now.
Just to be clear, Andrew is sitting in his building right now.
Yeah. We built this building as our first test case of the Assembly model. So this project for us, we are a high-rise modular builder. We can do up to about 30 stories from a technical physics perspective. But as I mentioned before, it's all about the strategy for commercialization. So when we said we were going to start building buildings, we did this whole exercise with the company called proves, punts, and undermines. And what we did is we said, as a company, what do we need to prove on our first project? What can we punt on? And if we punt on certain things, what are we going to actually undermine about our value proposition, right? Is it going to actually eat away at some of the narrative and brand that we have? And so what we decided on was we wanted multi-story building, right? We wanted to stack, and we wanted hair on it. And so what I mean by that is building in a market like New York is really, really hard. And we could choose some nice greenfield lot in the middle of nowhere and stack mods without an issue. Like, I'm sure that would have been much easier than what we're doing, but we wanted to have some complexity. So this site, right next to Atlantic Terminal, is on top of a bunch of subway tunnels. When you have that, you have the MTA as part of the approval process of the building. And we're also in a historic district. So we had landmarks as part of our approval process. And that is just, the right amount of hair on a funky deal to really prove that what we're doing can actually meet the battle standards of a market like New York, where, it might not be landmarks, but it might be a neighbor that doesn't give you access agreements, or it might be, your neighbor's building is actually leaning onto your property, so you have to make a last minute game change on the configuration, right? Like, those are things that happen in New York development. And so what we really wanted is to capture that in the smallest building we could, that if things went wrong, and things always go wrong in your first one, like, it wouldn't sink the company. And so that's how we honed in on this one.
And now you're living in it.
And now I'm living in it.
What lessons from your experience at your previous companies have been most valuable in building Assembly?
I've worked at 3 places before Assembly, putting aside like being a camp counselor. So I worked at Forest City, I worked at Sidewalk Labs, and then I worked at L&L. And I think Forest City, I worked very closely with Bruce Ratner and Marianne. And I think what I got from those sort of mentors and that whole approach there is it is only worth doing the hard, right? Like Forest City was known for building these buildings that changed neighborhoods. We built, a couple decades ago, all of Metro Tech. We built Atlantic Yards, which is anchored by the Barclays Center. We did the tallest modular tower. We did New York Times building, 8 Spruce, like all of these buildings that were like, wow, this can't be done. We did it. And I think that really just, that bug stuck with me, that like there are easier ways to build a career, right? But there are a lot of fun things about trying to do really hard things and getting 90%, getting 80%, making progress, changing an industry. So I think that was like the big takeaway from Forest City is like, go after the hard problems because those are the ones that are worth spending your career on. Then at Sidewalk Labs, I think this was probably like, I view it as almost like my MBA that they paid me to do, where I think, when a lot of people do their MBA, the biggest thing they take away was the people they met, the sort of like aperture opening that you get going through an MBA. And I think Sidewalk Labs for me was a similar like aperture opening, where one of the things that they did extremely well was they hired super smart people. And so one of the things that you found yourself there is you'd be in a room and you'd be the dumbest person in the room. And that is so fun because it means that you're just drinking from a fire hose on so many things. And so I think that was just like a really fun experience to be surrounded by people that had such domain expertise and stuff that you knew nothing about. And then at L&L, I think the big takeaway there was a little bit more like tactical, but working through the terminal warehouse project from a capital structure perspective during COVID was really a slog. Like it was a slog. And I think, my career maybe was a little bit backwards, but I think a lot of the technical skills of how do you structure a $1.3 billion construction loan when your prospects of leasing are decreasing because no one's in the office, like that was just hard. And we pushed through that. And I think there was a lot of, finesse and nuance with legal agreements and the structure of deals and org structure and how you bifurcate risk that really allowed that deal to move forward. And I think that was like a really valuable lesson, especially now that I deal a lot with the venture world. Like you're always thinking about their upside. Like, you have to sort of fit that incentive structure. And I think working through some of that while at L&L was really helpful to have that as part of my arsenal now at Assembly.
So let's get into the venture. You're one of the few companies building this physical world that are actually, you decided to go the venture route.
Yes.
Tell us about your financing journey. How did that come together? Tell us about it.
Yeah. So I think taking venture capital is one of the biggest commitments you make in your life. Like think about it at the scale of marriage, right? Because the dynamics of venture are they put in a small check, maybe not that small, right? We've taken tens and tens of millions of dollars, right? The last price round we did was our Series A, and that was a $40 million round. So, but relative to like what this company is going to be, a smallish check gets a chunk of the business, and then you work like heck to get to a place where you're actually a really, really valuable company. And so that's a long-term partnership that you're making very early in the company's life cycle. And I think that is just like advice and warning, like don't do that lightly, like really think about the business. And I think one of the hardest things about venture as it relates to our style of business, where we build buildings, we have factories, we also have software, we also have physical IP and patents, is that we're a lot of things. And when you think about most venture capitalists, not all, but most venture capitalists, there's a huge amount of pattern matching that goes into their decision making. Like, do you fit this box? Are you going to become the next Facebook? Are you going to become the next Uber? Are you going to become the next Stripe, right? Like there's all of these things that are trying to find what box you fit in. And then I show up and I'm like, hey, look at our first building. And they're like, wait, what? And so I think there's a really nuanced way of going about that. I think for us, the thing that I've had to focus a lot on when it comes to the venture markets is explaining how we are not just a modular factory manufacturer, right? Like, we have so much IP, digital tools that allow us to automate the design of these buildings. Like that is where the real scalable piece comes in. The fact that we have factories and some of the deals we're doing now, we're bringing in partners to operate the factories, so we don't need to have our own factories. That is a much smaller part of what makes assembly special. But the thing that everyone wants to see and touch is like the buildings and the factories. But that's probably the thing that makes it least appetizing to a venture investor. And so you have to thread that needle really, really carefully.
Yeah. So you build your first building and you built it in 24 hours. You stacked it up in 24 hours. So how did that happen? Your first building's in Fort Greene. How did you do it in one day?
Oh, yeah. So first building in Fort Greene is 8 modules. So basically I'm in a module, so you can kind of see it if you're watching it on the camera. So these are like 40-ish feet long, 10 feet wide, and they stacked in a single day. So the modules left the factory Friday evening, staged at the George Washington Bridge until midnight when you're allowed to cross over, arrived on site at about 1 a.m. The crane showed up at 3 a.m. We started stacking at 7 a.m. and the crane was coming down by 4:30. And there was a break in the middle for lunch. And so how did we actually, figure out how to do that? Lots and lots and lots of practice. So we spent probably the first 3 years of the company in what I would call a really intense R&D and prototyping phase. So we built structural chassis. We built a full 1-bedroom unit. We did stacking tests. We did transit tests. And then when it came to this building, before we actually brought it to the site, we stacked it multiple times in the parking lot. So finished building, leaves the factory, and we're just stacking like Legos in the parking lot to really hone in on the process, right? So how do you know that a building is going to stack in a day? Well, you do it a couple times before to know what's going to happen when you're on site, because you only get a day from the Department of Transportation to close the streets. Like, you don't stack in a day, you're waiting months for them to give you another road closure. So we really, in our ethos and our process, use these moments where you can do things like stack a building multiple times in the parking lot to move up that learning curve really rapidly to then de-risk the production of it, right? In a way that has high confidence going forward.
Got it. Why do you think modular construction is ripe for disruption today? There's been a lot of different companies that have sort of gone down under the past few years. What differentiates assembly?
Yeah. So I think there's 2 things that are embedded in that question, right? Like, why do we need to move towards modular and offsite, and then why assembly? And so on the why moving offsite, why modular, I think that is a perfect storm happening in the US market right now as it relates to the housing crisis. We need millions of units. On some of the upper estimates, it's 6.5 million units just to be at a place where we're meeting current housing demand. So huge, 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 huge housing crisis. Then we have climate change. And climate change doesn't matter where you sit on sort of like the political spectrum from a climate change perspective. It is changing the capital markets. It is changing regulation. It is changing where people want to live. And so when you think about that coupled with housing, it's a really 2 problems that can't be separated. And then the last is really as it relates to labor and the way that construction operates today. So we have a labor shortage in the construction industry. We can see that in a couple different ways. You can look at um, the aging population. You can look at the percentage of workers in the construction labor force that are of retirement age, like all of these different things that would indicate, we have a problem. But you could also just anecdotally think about what Gen Zs say they want as their number one job, and it's very rarely a construction worker. And so when you think about all of those together, we need a better way. We need to innovate our way out of that problem. And so that's just why the industry needs to take off and is going to take off. You think about why assembly, I think that's a little bit more nuanced, because what is really clear about the modular industry globally is that modular has worked, but not really well in the US. So then you look at places like Scandinavia, you look at places in Asia that have huge adoption of modular, and you're like, what gives, right? And it's not the physics of it. You can stack boxes regardless. It's really the business model. And so in the US, we build housing in a primarily private sector way, right? Even if you're building affordable housing, it's typically a private developer is using various incentives to build that housing. What private development means is it's cyclical. It is tied into the general macro forces. So it's interest rate dependent. It is cap rate dependent, which is correlated, right? It matters what the political winds are from a tax abatement policy, or whether a certain governor is pro-housing or not. So you end up in the US with a really, really long-term housing crisis, but a very, very cyclical issue as it relates to actual production because of the macro. And so when you think about the business model of most modular companies, what they do is they open a big factory. You see all these sexy robots running around, and they spent all of their venture dollars into that factory. And they sell to the most cyclical industry in the world. That is a recipe for disaster, right? So assembly's whole approach, right, is looking at that problem and saying, okay, we can stack boxes. That's not the hard part. There's innovation we can do there, but the real hard part is the business model. And so for us, what we've done is we've said, how do you make a modular execution of a building not tied to your physical fixed expenses in a factory? And that's where we honed in on this idea of distributed manufacturing. And our name kind of gives it away, but we do assembly. Our partners that make kitchen pods, bathroom pods, structures, walls, floors, ceilings, do the manufacturing. And so what we do is we'll receive these fully finished chunks in the same way that, Toyota, when they're building a Toyota Camry, gets a fully finished dashboard. We have a bathroom pod, they have a dashboard, Airbus gets a wing, we have a kitchen, and we just do assembly. And so that means that our factory looks much more like a warehouse, because we don't have to have a huge amount of fixed expense to actually get that running. So our productive capacity can dial up and down based on demand in a way that most other modular companies can't. And that is the big innovation, right? And to make that all work, you have to have a huge amount of technology, because if you're relying on someone to give you all of the components of your building, how do you actually do that? Well, you have to design at a much higher level of detail. How do you design at a much higher level of detail without increasing the time of a project? Well, you automate a bunch of it. And then you have to have massive quality management programs in place. You have to have excellent manufacturing engineering to understand the whole process and systems design coming together. And that's where the hard part is. And when you get a project, you turn all that on. And when you don't have a project, you turn it all off.
Wow. So let's dive deeper into the distributed manufacturing and the supply chain aspect of assembly. You run a pretty global supply chain.
Yes.
How does that work? Where do all the components come together? Where are you manufacturing? the bathrooms, where are you manufacturing, the structure? Like, how does all that come together?
Yeah. Right now, we have a supply chain that is primarily North and South American with a little bit in Europe. So the structural chassis for this building came from three places: New Jersey, Brazil, and Mexico. So, all over the place. The bathroom pods for this building came from South Dakota. We had windows. This is the one European thing. They came from Poland. The floors and walls and ceilings came from St. Louis. So really around these different places, as we scale, and we're now looking at a couple international markets to open factories with partners, we expect that supply chain will continue to grow and be more and more global. The way we think about how we choose the partners and what markets that we go after, it really is just an optimization function. So is the cost of that component low enough to justify the logistics of getting that component to us? And so a bathroom pod has a different set of logistical requirements than a stack of flat packed walls. But that allows us to think about all of these different suppliers and subassembly components in a unique optimization function for each of them. And so as you enter a new market, you might have a different optimization function for your bathroom if you're building up in Canada than if we're building here in New York, New Jersey. And so that's sort of how we think about it. So as we grow, we'll have partners, I would expect, from all around the world.
How do you continue to innovate while maintaining quality? And you have, like you said, you have all these moving pieces. If you're going to build in Europe, you may need another set of vendors and suppliers. How do you maintain quality and while building and scaling?
Quality is probably the hardest thing to do, because if you vertically integrated, if we did everything ourselves, quality is much easier because it's your people, it's your factory, it's you can oversee it directly. When you are relying on third parties to actually do the manufacturing for you, quality gets a little bit more nuanced because you can set the standards, but they're not your people. They don't work for you in a direct way. And so we actually have a director of quality that comes from, we basically wanted to get someone who's done it in multiple industries. So he has worked in consumer electronics and consumer appliances and in automotive. So different worlds, really, both of them have high expectations of quality. And he is now basically building that handbook for us and our approach to managing quality with all of these distributed suppliers. And I'd say, like, it really boils down to clear expectations, right? So you want to have critical to quality defined. You want to have clear inspection policies in place where they know that they need to inspect and certify leaving their factory. They know that we're going to inspect coming into our factory. And then you need to have a level of third-party certification for the things that really matter. So we will always have third-party special inspectors in our partners' factories for things that are, let's call it structural. Like, I don't want to take a chance on that. No one wants to take a chance on that. So we will have a third-party special inspector in that factory to make sure that they're actually delivering the quality and safety that we need to put into our buildings.
What are some of the major supply chain and manufacturing challenges you had to overcome?
So I'd say the biggest one at a macro level, and this is a business model one rather than a tactical one, is any manufacturing business and any business that relies on a supply chain understands that scale is an absolutely critical thing in driving your negotiations on price and quality and all of that. And where we are today in our journey, we're little assembly and big bad supplier, right? So the power dynamic is on their side. That will obviously shift as we get more and more buildings and as our scale increases. But the hardest thing to do is to shift that dynamic from their side of the table to our side of the table, right? And make sure that we can demand excellence, demand fair margins and stuff like that when it comes to suppliers. And I think that is basically the journey of assembly before we IPO, right? Like that's the whole thing, is how do you actually introduce enough scale that this machine works in a way where you can rely on these third parties. I think on a more tactical and practical perspective, we've had issues with suppliers that have dropped the ball. That's actually a big thing where you're relying on someone and they just don't perform up to your standards. I think part of our approach, and we come from construction, so we're very used to issues, right? Like that's like one of the skill sets that you learn in construction is like you just problem solve issues all day long. You don't assume success. You assume that something will go wrong and then you just deal with it. So we've had partners that have delivered subpar quality in terms of finishes. A lot of that has been dealt with via our contract structures. So what we will do with our partners that are supplying for us is we'll make sure that they either have a bond or a letter of credit in our favor. So if something goes wrong, there is a financial remedy in our favor to actually make it right. And we haven't had to call on any of that, but I think that is a really nice incentive aligning thing when it comes to these partners where they know you have a hammer. They'd much rather you use the carrot rather than the stick to actually resolve these issues. But I think that's important to have that contractual heft behind these agreements. And to my point earlier, like the power dynamic, you kind of need a little bit more power on our side. So we use the contractual structures to help us get there and keep their incentives to working out problems that have come up. As I said, like I live in our first building. I wouldn't live in it if it wasn't up to a standard to live in. Like there's going to be little things that we're going to find. And that's probably 90% of the reason I'm living here is to get those learnings. But on a whole, like we've been able to mitigate most of the manufacturing and supply chain issues that have come up.
In the US, this hasn't been adopted as much as in other parts of the world. In the US, how do you convince real estate developers to try out a different way of building?
Yeah, that is the $1 billion question. That is what I think about all day long, every day. And what I describe, this mode that we're in of a company is we have a lot of guinea pig risk. And what I mean by that is everyone looks at assembly as like, wow, you can build 30 stories building in half the time. And like they get the value proposition. They see it so clearly. But then the second sentence out of their mouth is, oh, but I want to be your fifth customer. I want to be your third customer. And that's just, they don't want to be the guinea pig. No one wants to be the guinea pig. And that's a lot. That's primarily from the way that real estate projects are capitalized. Real estate projects are capitalized as one-off entities, right? So you don't have any cross returns across the projects. It's separate capital, separate construction loans, separate investors on every single project. So what we've tried to do is identify developers and partners that have reasons to overcome guinea pig risk. And so some of those reasons might be they have better insight into the actual risks as opposed to perceived risks. So what we found is developers that have built modularly before, even if it was not a success, they really understand where the risk is and where the risk is not. And so when they look at something like assembly, they actually see a lot less risk because they know what sort of risk comes with the modular execution. And our distributed approach and the high fidelity modeling and all of the things that I've mentioned allow them to be like, oh, I have asymmetric information. This is actually much less risky than other people think it is. So I'm going to go into this. So we found success there. Another sort of topology of developer is one that has a strong incentive to build modularly because they kind of have to. So there are some developers that have RFPs and awards from governments that say they have to use a certain type of innovation or stuff like that. So that's another category. And then the last, I think, in this guinea pig risk taking category is developers that have pipeline. And so they are seeing assembly not as a solution to a one-off building, but a solution to a suite of buildings that they might be building in a certain market or a certain region. And if we can get a couple buildings done with them in the early phases, the rest are going to be way de-risked and much more successful. And so those are the investors and developers that we're looking to go after from a customer side. The other that we found success in is finding developers that also want to be a part of assembly's journey. And so that might be they want to be on the cap table on the venture side, but we're actually finding a couple of people that just want to be partners on the factory. So I don't know if you saw the Greystar article the other day where Greystar opened its own modular factory. And I think that's actually become a little bit of a trend where developers are going to see the value of modular and are going to look to assembly to help them open an assembly style modular factory. So, think developer name powered by assembly. Like that is something that allows them to overcome some of that guinea pig risk because their incentives are perfectly aligned in moving it to a place where we're at scale and execution from that factory.
Looking ahead, I'm curious how you see the future of construction. Where's assembly headed? Tell me more.
The future of construction is going to look more like manufacturing than construction. And I'm very specific in what I'm saying there. I'm not saying every building is going to be modular, right? I'm not saying every building is going to be a volumetric box stacked up, because I actually don't think that is the solution to every building. I actually think assembly can be a very large, multi-billion dollar business building a slice of the market. But the overall construction market is going to move towards manufacturing. And what I mean by that is leverage of third parties that manufacture components offsite. I think that is definitely going to happen. Process focus and quality focus that are sort of second nature in manufacturing and completely foreign in construction. That is going to happen. And then I think one of the things that has happened over the last 50 years, maybe even 100 years in construction, architecture, and engineering is there's been a siloing effect of all of the stakeholders involved in real estate development. So the architect does this tiny sliver, the engineer does this tiny sliver. And a lot of that is like thrown over the fence to the contractors that figure out what to do. And we call it means and methods. The architects and engineers are no longer responsible for the means and methods. It's all punted to the contractor. Now, if you think about that in like an automotive context, it is as if an automotive manufacturer does a concept sketch, like a concept car sketch on paper, and then hands it to someone and says, build this. That is how construction works today. They don't tell you how or, anything like that. It's just like, just build this, make it look like this at the end of the day. That opens up so much human error. That opens up all of the cost overruns that we hear about in construction. And so I think what's going to happen is those silos are going to be closed by technology. The technology is already there, right? We can model at a really high level of fidelity. We need to bring it from other industries into construction. And then we need to start thinking about changing the contractual structures that cement those silos in place to think about breaking those so that the technology can actually break the silo rather than really improve, point solutions within each silo, but the interfaces amongst those silos are still very manual. And I think that's going to happen. Part of it's going to be companies like Assembly changing how you build it, what you're building, but also the business and contract structure and like just moving the needle forward on that to change the overall focus on how you build these next generation of buildings.
What do you think is the most important unsolved problem in your field right now?
I'm going to answer this in a way. I think the biggest unsolved problem for like modular in the construction industry is actually how the construction financing industry works as opposed to how manufacturing finance works. There's like a gap there that needs to be filled in order for this industry to truly take off. Assembly, through our approach, allows us to fill that gap, but not everyone's going to, work the way assembly does. And I think what we need to do is reframe sort of like construction finance and start looking at precedents from other industries and bring those tools and structures to construction. I think, the overall prop tech, real estate tech, construction tech has been grappling this for a long time, right? The industry is trying to find the right structure to fund these types of businesses, to fund the next generation of these projects, but it's not there yet. And I think that is probably where the biggest innovation is going to come. And I think, I've spoken to in the last few weeks some funds that are thinking about this in pretty unique ways. But I do think that is going to have to catch up to where these companies are, because the funding of these companies, the funding of the projects that these companies build needs to have the capital to actually get to a scale that makes an impact.
All these manufacturing companies that are just popping up all of a sudden in this world, we either become cash flow positive and we build a company like that, but we also live in this world where things just have to happen so quickly now.
Yes.
That we don't know how to finance growth anymore. And the traditional venture doesn't know how to support these kinds of companies either.
Oh.
We're like building this physical world and we just don't know how to finance it quickly. And that's why we're stuck with all these old incumbents.
One of the nice, I don't know, maybe AI burst my bubble on this, but before the AI hype, I was thinking we were nearing the end of the sort of like easy money coming out of venture. Like, okay, like we've extracted all, like every SaaS business that should be built is built, right? Like, that's an overgeneralization, but like, okay, we've done the SaaS, we've done marketplaces, like we've got that. Like the venture markets have to create alpha. Otherwise they're not going to continue to raise capital from their LPs. So like, where are they going to go next? I was like, oh, well, it's logically going to be sort of like in the physical world. And then the AI people came in and it was like, well, no, easy money again. A lot of what I actually think is going to change some of that is taking some of the learnings from these other venture backable or more venture friendly industries and seeing how to bring that into your physical world. Like, a lot of what we're doing now is thinking about with AI and where it is and like the acceleration of its, not just the technology and the underlying foundational models, but it's like acceptance and adoption and ease of actually building with it. Like we can really automate a huge amount of our workflows. Like that has changed the scalability of our business model in a huge way. And we're just scratching the surface of what that's going to do, because we are just now building the infrastructure to support all of that on top. And these models are just getting better. And like the combination of those will change our business. But it's the venture markets plus physical is a hard thing to reconcile.
Yeah, they don't know what to do yet. With assembly, what's next? What's your next building? What's your pipeline look like? Tell me more.
Yeah. So we look at pipeline in a couple ways. We look at pipeline of buildings. So we have a 15-story building here in Manhattan that's designed. We are in design on a 19-story building up in Massachusetts. So like one of those will be the next building that we'll build in this market. But we're also looking at expanding into other markets with partners. So We're working on a deal up in Canada. We're working on a deal in the UK to start bringing this to other markets. And I think one of the big learnings that I've taken in the last few years is Assembly's model is really unique in the fact that like we can dial up and dial down that productive capacity, right? But we need to be as resilient as possible. So the market, interest rates have been really high. Demand has been really low on new buildings, but our model allows us to stay alive and thrive and keep innovating. But are there other markets where it's less cyclical? And so we found in some of these other markets that like it is less cyclical, really easy for us to enter that market in a matter of months, and we can capture that opportunity and build in some diversification from a geographic and topology standpoint. So that's where our head is at now. It's like build pipeline here in our core Northeast market, and then think about additional markets that we can enter and really capture some of that demand. And in those other markets, we're thinking about this as like a powered by assembly model where we find a partner, either a developer or an existing modular operator or someone who has, a different factory making, maybe facades, and we help turn them into an assembly, tier one assembler for our types of projects. And we're finding that that is a really interesting model. And honestly, one that we're getting a lot of like venture interest on because it sheds that factory expense. And we're really that like enabling tech layer on physical partners that use our technology to build these buildings. Basically, like we become the owners of the Lego IP, and we have the contract with the manufacturer of the Legos. And so when you want the Legos, we'll license you the Legos and let you use our manufacturing partner. Like that's the model.
What advice would you give to entrepreneurs building in this physical world that want to start a manufacturing-based business today?
Great question. I think a couple things. One, really think to yourself if you like doing hard things. There are easy businesses to build that have tailwinds that push you forward and or ride the hype cycle. And then there are hard businesses that have headwinds that actually change the world. But like everyone is going to tell you your idea is stupid and you're going to have to fight for every dollar and you're going to have to work like hell to actually deliver. Like the physical businesses and manufacturing businesses are in that second camp. Like it is hard. And so if you're like dabbling with the idea of entrepreneurship or want to start a startup and like are thinking about ideas, like there are hard businesses you can start, but you have to want to do that. So I think that's that. I think the other piece of advice is like think really hard about your funding strategy and the milestones of your company. So venture-backed businesses live and die based on hitting their milestones. And you need to be able to make forward progress via these milestones that you set. But you need to keep the money coming in, and you need to build in the reality that things might not go perfectly. And so you have to just think about all of that.
Well, Andrew, this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your journey, for sharing what Assembly's up to. Really, it's a privilege to speak with you. Thank you.
No, thank you. This has been great. I'm really excited to see the podcast and listen to the rest of them.
Yeah, I'm excited.